The saloon door exploded open with such force it nearly tore from its hinges, sending a cloud of Arizona dust swirling through the dimly lit room. Every conversation died as the tiny figure of Tommy Rawlings stumbled inside, his boots scraping against the rough wooden floor. In his trembling hands, he clutched a blood-stained piece of fabric that seemed to pulse with accusation in the amber lamplight. Martha Sullivan didn't even look up from the whiskey glass she was polishing behind the bar. She'd heard those particular footsteps before, desperate and angry, belonging to men who thought they'd discovered something that would change everything. At 45, she'd outlived most of her accusers. "You killed them." Tommy's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room, high-pitched with youth and rage. "You killed James Morrison, Bill Crawford, and—" His voice broke entirely. "And Henry Walsh." The glass in Martha's hand continued its slow, methodical rotation against the dirty cloth. Around the saloon, the usual collection of miners, drifters, and broken men held their breath. Everyone in Redemption Valley knew that Martha Sullivan was dangerous, but nobody had ever been foolish enough to confront her so directly. "That's quite an accusation, boy." Martha finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of gravel and whiskey. "You best be certain before you go throwing names around like that." Tommy's face flushed red beneath the layer of dust and sweat. His small frame shook with emotion as he held up the fabric higher. "This was wrapped around my father's old pistol in the cellar. Along with this." From his vest pocket, he produced a yellowed piece of paper, its edges brown with age and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Martha's hand stopped moving. For the first time since the boy had burst through those doors, she lifted her dark eyes to meet his. There was something in that gaze that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees, something that reminded every man present why they'd never dared cross Martha Sullivan before. "Your father's cellar, you say?" She set the glass down with deliberate care, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. "And what exactly do you think that proves, Tommy Rawlings?" The use of his full name made Tommy step backward involuntarily, but he steadied himself against a nearby table. "It proves you're a murderer. It proves you killed 3 men in cold blood 15 years ago, and it proves my father knew about it." Martha came around the bar slowly, each step measured and predatory. She was a handsome woman despite the hard lines around her eyes and the premature gray streaking through her dark hair. There was a time when she might have been considered beautiful, before life in Redemption Valley had carved away everything soft about her. "Your father," she said, tasting the words like they were bitter medicine, "was a good man. Too good for his own sake, some might say. Don't you dare talk about him like you knew him." Tommy spat, though his voice wavered slightly. "He was an honest rancher who worked himself to death, trying to keep his land." Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "Oh, child, I knew your father better than you ever did. I knew him when he was young and foolish enough to believe that love could wash the sin off a woman like me." The admission hit Tommy like a physical blow. His grip on the blood-stained cloth tightened until his knuckles went white. "You're lying." "Am I?" Martha was close enough now that Tommy could smell the whiskey on her breath, see the network of fine scars across her knuckles that spoke of violence survived and violence delivered. "Your father used to come into this very saloon, back when it was run by old Pete McMurphy. He'd sit right there." She pointed to a table in the corner. "And he'd watch me work, thinking I didn't notice." Tommy's face had gone pale now, the angry flush replaced by something closer to sick fear. "My father would never." "Your father fell in love with a whore, boy. And not just any whore, but one who'd already spilled enough blood to flood the creek outside." Martha's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the deadly silence of the saloon, every word carried perfectly. "He thought he could save me. Thought his pure love was strong enough to wash away what I'd done." She reached out suddenly and grasped Tommy's wrist, her fingers like iron bands around his thin bones. "But I warned him, just like I'm warning you now. I am dirt no water can wash. Not his water, not God's rain, not all the tears in creation." Tommy tried to pull away, but her grip was unbreakable. Up close, he could see something in her eyes that terrified him more than anger or cruelty, something that looked almost like sorrow. "The blood on that cloth," she continued in that same deadly quiet voice, "belongs to 3 men who thought they could take what wasn't offered. 3 men who thought because I sold my body, they owned my soul. Her free hand moved to the small of her back, where Tommy now noticed the outline of a knife handle beneath her worn dress. They were wrong. But why? Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper. Why did my father keep the evidence? Why didn't he turn you in? Martha's grip loosened slightly, and for just a moment, the hardness in her face cracked like dried earth after the first rain. Because he loved me, you foolish child. Because even after I told him what I was, what I'd done, he still believed I could be something different. She released his wrist and stepped back, but her eyes never left his face. Your father kept that evidence not to protect the world from me, but to protect me from the world. He knew that if anyone else found it, they'd hang me before I could explain why I had to kill those men. Tommy rubbed his wrist where her fingers had been, red marks already forming on his pale skin. And did you? Did you become something different? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Around the saloon, the miners and drifters remained frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid of breaking whatever spell held this moment suspended between violence and revelation. Martha walked to the window and stared out at the dusty main street of Redemption Valley. In the distance, the mountains rose like broken teeth against the burning sky, and the wind carried the sound of the mill grinding or into powder. Your mother, she said finally, her voice so quiet Tommy had to strain to hear her. Sarah Henderson, before she married your father. She knew about those 3 men too. Tommy's heart stopped. He'd never heard anyone speak his mother's maiden name, had never known she'd lived in Redemption Valley before marrying his father. According to family legend, his parents had met in Phoenix and moved to the ranch together as newlyweds. My mother never lived here, he managed to say, but even as the words left his mouth, he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Martha turned from the window, and Tommy saw something in her expression that was worse than cruelty, worse than anger. He saw truth. Your mother worked in this saloon for 2 years before she met your father. She served drinks and danced with miners and listened to their troubles. She was the closest thing to a friend I ever had in this godforsaken town. Martha's hand moved unconsciously to a small locket at her throat, her fingers tracing its outline through the fabric of her dress. She was here the night I killed those 3 men. She was here when they cornered me in the back room and decided they were tired of paying for what they could just take. The saloon seemed to shrink around Tommy, the walls closing in as the truth crashed over him like a physical weight. His mother, the gentle woman who'd read him Bible stories and sung lullabies, had been a saloon girl, had witnessed murder, had kept the secret her entire life. Sarah tried to stop me, Martha continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. She begged me to just run, to escape while I could. But I couldn't run from what they'd done to other girls, what they were planning to do to her next. Tommy felt the blood-stained cloth slip from his numb fingers and flutter to the floor like a dying bird. She left because of what you did. She left because she was afraid of what I was becoming. And she was right to be afraid. Martha's hand dropped from the locket, and when she looked at Tommy again, her eyes were dry and pitiless once more. Your father found her in Phoenix 3 months later, broken and scared, and trying to forget everything about this place. He married her and brought her back to the ranch, thinking distance would be enough to keep the past buried. But it wasn't buried, Tommy whispered. He kept the evidence. He kept it because he knew someday someone would come looking for answers. Someone like you. Martha moved away from the window, her boots clicking against the wooden floor with mechanical precision. He kept it because he loved us both too much to let either of us disappear completely. Tommy bent slowly and picked up the fallen cloth, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grasp the stained fabric. When he straightened, he found Martha watching him with an expression he couldn't read. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the saloon's broken shutters. Martha smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Tommy had ever seen on a human face. Now, boy, you have to decide what kind of man your father raised you to be. Are you the kind who turns in a killer because the law demands it? Or are you the kind who understands that sometimes justice and the law aren't the same thing? Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the dusty windows. But inside the saloon, the air remained thick and stifling, heavy with secrets and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Tommy clutched the blood-stained evidence against his chest and stared into Martha Sullivan's unforgiving eyes, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few moments would define not just his future, but his understanding of everything his parents had taught him about right and wrong, love and justice, and the terrible complexity of being human in a world that offered no easy answers. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. While outside the storm moved closer and the wind began to howl through the streets of Redemption Valley like the voices of the dead crying for justice or mercy, neither of which seemed possible in equal measure. The silence between Tommy and Martha stretched like a chasm until it was broken by the sound of spurs jingling on the saloon's front porch. Both of them froze as heavy footsteps approached the door, and Martha's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at her back. Sheriff Wade Hutchins pushed through the swinging doors, his weathered face scanning the room with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 20 years keeping peace in places where peace was a rare commodity. His gaze lingered on the blood-stained cloth in Tommy's hands before settling on Martha's tense posture. "Afternoon, Martha," he said with careful neutrality, touching the brim of his hat. "Tommy." The sheriff's presence seemed to suck all the remaining air from the room, and the few patrons who'd been pretending not to listen began edging toward the back exit. "Sheriff," Martha replied, her voice steady as granite. "What brings you by today?" Hutchins stepped fully into the room, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Funny thing happened this morning. Old Mrs. Kowalski came by the office, said she saw young Tommy here breaking into his daddy's root cellar with a crowbar. Said he looked mighty agitated about something." His eyes flicked to the cloth again. She was worried he might be disturbing Daniel's rest. Tommy felt his throat close up. He'd been so focused on confronting Martha that he'd never considered someone might have seen him digging through his father's hidden belongings. Now the evidence was in his hands. The confession had been made, and the law stood between him and whatever choice he'd been about to make. "The boy's just grieving, Sheriff," Martha said smoothly. "Sometimes grief makes people do strange things. Look for answers where there might not be any." But Hutchins wasn't a fool. He'd survived 2 decades of frontier justice by reading the currents that ran beneath the surface of every conversation, every glance, every carefully chosen word. "That's so? What kind of answers were you looking for, son?" Tommy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The blood-stained evidence seemed to burn in his hands, and he could feel Martha's eyes boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Around them, the last few customers quietly slipped out the back door, leaving only the 3 of them in the growing shadows of the afternoon. "I was looking for answers about my mother," Tommy finally managed to say, and he saw Martha's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "My father never talked much about how they met." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Daniel was a private man, that's true enough. But son, sometimes the past is buried for good reason. Your daddy and mama, they built a good life together out at that ranch. Maybe it's better to honor that than to go digging up old sorrows." "But what if the past won't stay buried?" Tommy asked, his voice gaining strength. "What if it's been sitting in a root cellar for 15 years, waiting for someone to find it?" Hutchins took a step closer, and Tommy could see the calculation in the older man's eyes. The sheriff was putting pieces together, adding up the blood-stained cloth, Martha's carefully controlled demeanor, and Tommy's obvious distress. "What exactly did you find in that cellar, boy?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Tommy could feel the weight of choice pressing down on him like a physical thing. In his hands, he held evidence of murder. Across the room stood a woman who'd confessed to killing 3 men. Between them stood the law, waiting for him to speak the words that would either damn Martha Sullivan or set her free. But as Tommy opened his mouth to answer, Martha spoke instead. "He found a letter," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of final decision. "A letter his father wrote to his mother before they were married, telling her about the woman he'd fallen in love with in Redemption Valley. The woman who was too damaged by violence to accept the salvation he offered." Hutchins frowned, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "What kind of letter?" Martha moved to the bar and poured herself a whiskey with hands that remained perfectly steady. "The kind a good man writes when he wants to be honest about his past with the woman he intends to marry. The kind that explains why he keeps a piece of blood-stained cloth locked away in his cellar, not as evidence of a crime, but as a reminder of the moment, he realized some stains can't be washed clean. Tommy stared at her in amazement. She was lying, spinning a story that contained threads of truth, but wove them into something entirely different from reality. She was protecting him from having to make the choice between law and justice, between condemning her and carrying the burden of her secret. Your father loved me, Martha continued, meeting Tommy's eyes directly. But he understood that love doesn't always mean salvation. Sometimes it means accepting that the person you care about is exactly who they need to be, scars and all. The sheriff looked between them, his experienced instincts telling him there was more to this story than he was hearing. And this cloth belonged to one of the men who attacked me 15 years ago, Martha said without hesitation. The night I killed Bill Crawford, James Morrison, and Henry Walsh in self-defense. The admission hit the room like thunder. Hutchins' hand moved to his gun, but Martha raised her free hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both surrender and defiance. They cornered me in the back room of this saloon, she continued, her voice never wavering. They'd been drinking all evening, talking about how they were tired of paying for what they figured they could just take. When they came for me, I had Daniel's old knife hidden in my dress. She touched the small blade at her back. I used it. Martha, Hutchins said carefully, you're confessing to triple murder. I'm confessing to staying alive, she corrected. Those men would have killed me when they were finished. They'd done it before to other girls, in other towns. Everyone knew it, but nobody cared enough to stop them. Tommy watched the sheriff's face as he processed this information. Wade Hutchins had been keeping peace in frontier towns long enough to know that justice and law didn't always align perfectly. He'd seen men hanged for stealing horses while murderers walked free because they had money or connections, or simply because no one cared about their victims. Who else knows about this? Hutchins asked finally. Daniel knew, Martha said. Sarah knew, because she was here that night. And now Tommy knows, because he found the evidence his father kept. She drained her whiskey in one smooth motion. That's it. Everyone else who might have cared is dead or gone. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Outside, the storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke, and rain began hammering against the saloon's windows with increasing intensity. Self-defense, he said finally. 3 armed men against 1 woman. No witnesses left alive to contradict your story. He looked directly at Tommy. That cloth and whatever else you found, that's just your daddy's way of keeping track of the woman he cared about, making sure her story got told if something ever happened to her. Tommy felt a surge of understanding wash over him. The sheriff wasn't just accepting Martha's confession, he was actively choosing to interpret it in the most charitable light possible. Not because he was corrupt or lazy, but because he understood something about frontier justice that Tommy was only beginning to grasp. What happens now? Tommy asked, echoing his earlier question to Martha. Hutchins settled his hat more firmly on his head and turned toward the door. Now, you bury that cloth with your daddy, where it belongs. You honor his memory by understanding that he was a man who knew the difference between legal justice and moral justice. He paused with his hand on the door frame. And you learn to live with the fact that sometimes the most decent thing you can do is keep your mouth shut. After the sheriff left, Tommy and Martha stood alone in the rain-dimmed saloon, the sound of the storm outside filling the spaces between them. Tommy still held the blood-stained evidence, but it felt different now, less like an accusation and more like a trust his father had left him. Why did you protect me? He asked. You could have let me turn you in. Martha poured herself another whiskey and offered one to Tommy, who surprised himself by accepting it. Because you're Sarah's boy, she said simply. Because your father loved us both enough to keep our secrets safe. And because maybe, after 15 years of being exactly who I chose to be, I'm finally ready to try being someone different. Tommy sipped the whiskey and felt it burn all the way down. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see the lights beginning to come on in the houses scattered along Redemption Valley's main street. Families gathering for dinner, children being called in from play, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing despite the extraordinary revelations of the afternoon. Tell me about my mother, he said quietly. Tell me who she really was, before she became the woman who raised me. Martha smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes. Sarah was the bravest person I ever met. She saw me kill 3 men in cold blood, and instead of running or screaming or calling for help, She helped me clean up the mess. Then she looked me in the eye and told me I had a choice to make about what kind of woman I was going to be from that moment forward. And what choice did you make? I chose to be exactly what I warned your father I was. Dirt that no water could wash clean. Martha's fingers found the locket at her throat again, and this time she opened it, revealing a small photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and Sarah's unmistakable smile. But your mother chose to believe people could change, could be forgiven, could start over. She married your father and created a life full of love and decency and hope. Tommy studied the photograph, seeing his mother as she'd been before marriage and motherhood had shaped her into the woman he remembered. Do you think she was right? About people being able to change. Martha closed the locket and met his eyes directly. I think your mother was right about most things. And I think your father was right to love us both, each in our own way, without trying to make us into something we weren't. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the hammering rain fading to a steady patter against the windows. Tommy finished his whiskey and set the glass on the bar, then carefully folded the blood-stained cloth and tucked it into his vest pocket. I'm going to bury this with my father, he said. Not because the sheriff told me to, but because I think that's what he would have wanted. And after that, Tommy looked around the saloon, taking in the scarred wooden floors, the bullet holes in the walls, the atmosphere of violence and secrets that seemed to permeate every inch of the place. After that, I'm going to try to understand what it means to be a good man in a world where good and evil aren't as clear-cut as I used to think they were. Martha nodded slowly. That's the most important lesson your father ever could have taught you. Most people spend their whole lives thinking the world is painted in black and white, never realizing that the truth lives in all the shades of gray between. As Tommy headed for the door, Martha called out to him one last time. Tommy, your mother's grave, out at the ranch cemetery. There's a headstone there that doesn't have a name on it, just dates. That's for the girl who died in this saloon 15 years ago, the one who never got a chance to become the woman your mother turned into. Tommy paused in the doorway, rain beginning to spatter against his face. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for being man enough to handle it, Martha replied. Your father would be proud. As Tommy walked out into the storm, heading home to bury the past where it belonged, Martha poured herself one more whiskey and settled in to watch the rain wash the dust from Redemption Valley streets. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to be something other than the dirt no water could wash, to be a woman who could choose redemption over reputation, mercy over the harsh justice of the frontier. Outside, the storm was passing, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like the sound of old sins finally finding their rest.